afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our final per capita webinar for 2021. My name's Emma Dawson. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the Executive Director here at Per Capita, and I'm joining you today from the lands of the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to their elders past and present and thank them for their generations of careful custodianship of the lands and waters on which we now live, lands which were never ceded. I'm sure wherever you are, you will join me in paying respects to the elders on your lands and to any First Nations people joining us today. I'm really chuffed today to be talking to my good friend Van Badham, who has written an amazing and quite terrifying book that you may have seen around the traps. It's doing pretty interesting business, and that's because it's incredibly relevant to the times that we live in. QAnon and On, a short and shocking history of internet conspiracy cults. And I can't think of anybody better to write about this subject than you, Van. Before we kick off, I just want to let people know we are recording today's session. If you would like to pose a question to Van, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can place a question in there, and I'll do my best to get to as many of them as possible. We'll do that towards the end of our time together today. But firstly, I'm going to say welcome, Van. It's great to see you. And
hi.
What on earth possessed you to go down this rabbit hole?
Okay, firstly, I'd like to acknowledge today I'm on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I similarly extend my respect and humility to elders past, present, and emerging for their careful custodianship of these beautiful lands that I'm on. I was inspired to write this book because a couple of years ago I started getting, I get trolled on the internet all the time. Anybody who knows you, who knows me, knows that we tend to attract it. And I keep files on all the people who troll me because I've been subjected to harassment and violence on the basis of my folk villain-like reputation on the internet. And so obviously when anybody attacks me, I make a note of the account, I block the account, and I open a file just in case it escalates into stalker behavior, which has happened to me before.
Yeah.
Anyway, a couple of years ago, I noticed this new strain of trolling, and because, there are all kinds of different groups that troll me for various reasons, but it was a strain with this sort of quasi-religious apocalyptic language. And of course, I look up the accounts and I sort of make a note about where they're coming from and, for the purposes of the file. And I was like, what is this? And it was this, community of people who were sharing an interest in the prophecies of this guru called Q, who was posting to 4chan and then 8chan. And I think they sort of found me by the time they were already at 8chan. And I was just like, this is desperately weird kind of stuff, and checked out the things they were referring to. And they seemed to be decoding secret messages on the internet and from this guy. And there was this community. And I was like, I've seen a lot of wackos on the internet, but this is next level. And got really interested in it. And when it sort of grew and took more of an intrusive campaign approach in American political life, and American journalists started writing about it, I started following the story of who this new sort of movement were. And essentially, it was pretty easy to identify them as a cult. Like, it was cult behavior with sacred texts and a community of fervent believers who were willing to, foster interpretations of these prophecies that were being made on 8chan by this random, apparently unidentifiable person. And to create this sort of strange fusion of like religious and political belief. And essentially, for those of you who are here because, Emma and I are so charming, as opposed to drawn here for more answers on QAnon. Like, QAnon is the name given to the cult of people who have formed around this internet prophet who calls themselves Q, who has still not been identified. This person says that they are an agent with a Q clearance, which is an American intelligence security clearance. It actually has to do with nuclear energy. That's not really what gets talked about in these posts, but never mind. And the essential mythos of Q is that there's a global conspiracy of elites. Hillary Clinton is involved, and so are all of her friends. And these elites snatch children under our noses and torture and eat them to obtain a chemical called adrenochrome, which gives them magical powers and like fountain of youth and vitality, and they feed on like the terror of children. But Donald Trump is secretly a hero, and he might be pretending publicly to be an incompetent clown, but he is fighting against this cabal of elites, and Q is one of his loyal soldiers and is sharing these, like these cryptic messages for other highly intelligent people to decode so they know what's going on. And if it sounds like something out of a novel, I mean, that's true, because it just liberally takes from particularly Robert Ludlum and Tom Clancy novels. And the Q, like there is also a novel called Q Clearance, which might have inspired, given the sort of genre of spy stuff going on there. There's a novel from the same sort of peak period as Robert Ludlum and Tom Clancy that uses a lot of this language as well. And yeah, and it's a cult of people who genuinely believe this stuff.
And so, and you decided not only to monitor it, but actually to go undercover.
Well, yeah. So after I got really familiar with what was going on and sort of checking in on it online and reading a lot of other journalism about it, I went to my social media followers on Twitter and Facebook and went, "Hey, has anybody had any contact with the QAnon cult?" And people came out of the woodwork, like literally hundreds of people going, "Oh my God, my brother, my cousin, my niece, this has had this profound effect on our family. Like this loved one of mine is now spouting all this gibberish about cabals and cryptic messages." And I got really interested in it. There was a breaking piece of news when it was spilled that one of the biggest QAnon communities on the internet was the person behind it was exposed. And this was a community that was doing like huge business, like was getting hundreds of thousands of hits and people congregating there to share information and share their interpretations of these predictions that were appearing online. And the guy who was behind this website turned out to be a senior vice president at Citibank who had an interest in data mining. And of course, the thing is that these are quite lucrative operations. Like if you have like a million people who will give you $10 to listen to your, to join your community of Q believers, you've just made $10 million. And so there are all of these sort of private Q facilitating services that exist online, whether they're communities or people who sell merchandise. They call it conspiracy entrepreneurialism, and these sort of grifters who attach to these online movements to make money. Anyway, the fact that it was a senior vice president from Citibank was pretty significant. And I wrote an article about it saying, like, this Q thing that's happening is, like, pretty dodgy. And it is entirely likely, dear believers, that you are being seriously fleeced by people who really know what they're doing. And this article I wrote for The Guardian went completely viral, like a massive audience. And people wrote to me from all over the world telling me their stories about loved ones who'd become involved in the cult. And I got a phone call from Hardy Grant, who's a publisher that have an office in Melbourne, and they said, "Would you be interested in writing about this?" And I went, "Sure." And of course, then I went out to my social media following again and went, "Tell me your stories." And I got hundreds of them. Like I got hundreds and hundreds of stories about all these encounters people had with Q believers who were evangelicizing. So I was contacted by someone who'd been in an optometrist chair with the glasses on them, getting their sight measured. And the optometrist was a Q believer and started talking about Hillary Clinton torturing children under the streets of Washington. And then I was contacted by someone else who'd been evangelicized by a Q believer at a garage sale for like a church. It was like a church fundraising jumble sale. And this woman sort of cornered her and started talking about the lizard people, which is another facet of the belief system, not shared by all, but shared by some. And these madder and madder stories that people had. And there are communities on the internet. At the time that I started writing the book, there was a Reddit community called QAnon Casualties that was for people who'd had this problem with loved ones getting involved in QAnon and leaving us, basically, to join the land of extremist belief systems on the internet. And I think at the time that I started writing the book, that community had 9,000 members. And I checked it the other day and it's now well more than 200,000. So, I mean, it's quite a problem, and there was more material than I could possibly process that came forward in the process of research. But to understand these people and to really get a handle on what their communities look like and what were their animating values, I joined I created some fake personas and put some time into developing them to see which personas were sort of Q identifiable. And I joined a bunch of Q groups online and made Q friends. So I've got this quite extensive network of people who don't know it's me, who think I am a Q believer, who I check in with, and I made friends with them, and I use that to get an understanding of who was getting involved in this cult. And it was genuinely terrifying. Like, I do undercover stuff all the time. Like, I spent a year in the Hillsong Church about 10 years ago to write a musical about Hillsong and prosperity, theology, Christianity. And I did that one in person. And that was, I mean, quite an experience. Fortunately, I've forgotten all the words to the songs, but it took some effort. And then a few years ago, I did another undercover, this one online in the pickup artist community, because I was writing a play about guys who, go to these courses and learn all these strategies for picking up women. And in both of those cases, like, I did develop an empathy for the people who I was observing and got to know. A lot of the Hillsong people were people who really needed the structure of a faith to give their lives meaning and purpose. And with pickup artists, these guys want love and sexual connection, and that's pretty human. Even though they're like vile misogynists, they were more sad and pathetic and lonely than they were frightening in many ways. And you could see, all it would take would one person to be nice to them and they would leave that community. I didn't have that sense of empathy with QAnon believers. Like, I found people who believed things that were clearly untrue because they wanted to believe them, and a community that was actually quite superficial and harmful. And it's been quite a ride for the past year having that kind of connection.
Yeah, I can only imagine. I've spoken to you at times over the past year, and it's quite you've quite taken one for the team here, Van. You've gone into some spaces that really are pretty terrifying. Are you okay?
Oh, I had weeks of nightmares. Like, I literally had weeks of nightmares. And my partner, who was really supportive of the project and thought it was a great thing for me to do, he did say at one point, because I was like debriefing all the time, going, oh, I've just learnt this awful thing, or I've just had this awful conversation, or somebody's just told me something awful. And I mean, awful was a theme. Awful was a definite theme. And he reached the point where he was like, I'm trying to hold the rest of our lives together. I'm happy to do all the cooking, all the cleaning, keep the household functional, but I am not going to, I can't do that if I am listening to these terrible stories all the time, because I will need to process them as well. So maybe pick a friend who can be your person who you debrief to, and I will just keep everything going until the book is finished. And that's really where we got to. I mean, I had days where I was like, why is this happening? Like, how did the world get so dark, and who are these people, and why are they doing this? And yeah, like, it was a really confronting experience, quite existentially devastating. But of course, the longer I sort of stayed in the story and picked through this sort of detritus of awful, I did come across people who who had been QAnon believers, who came out the other side and were traveling the world essentially on an apology tour to explain how the cult got to them and how they got out of it. And that was really good. And also, I realized that the more I knew about how these sort of groups operated, the more I was in a position to tell a story that would hopefully motivate policy action and political change, and at very least a greater awareness in the community of what we're dealing with. Because the big surprise of the book, like, I had a very, based on the investigations I'd done of Hillsong and of the pickup artist community, I had an idea that I would be doing this investigation of people and individuals who had become part of this sort of cult-like operation, and that I would be telling these sort of really personal stories about the individuals who get swept up in these things. But I instead became really interested, like they were actually the least interesting part of the story. Like these sort of, because they had one story to tell, which was, I want to blame somebody else for all the problems in my life, and politically I'm channeling that energy towards these mythologies that are told to me about Hillary Clinton or whoever, and I can focus all of my political attention on these targets because somebody has given me a pretext for a hate I already have. And that's not, I mean, that's interesting, but that's not a story that you can tell over the course of a 350-page book. The story I became more interested in is that there has been quite a concerted effort over the years for by people like Steve Bannon and other sort of simpatico political movements on the right to weaponize communities of conspiracy believers. So once upon a time, you used to have, like, you know, crazy Uncle Bert who would turn up in his tinfoil helmet at Christmas and tell you the CIA were listening to his thoughts and had something to do with the lizard people, and you'd be like, yeah, no problem, Bert. And Bert lived his own life and probably got some weird magazines, and that was really as complicated as it got. What QAnon and the other internet conspiracy cults have done, because there's more than one, like they're all, 5G people and anti-vax people, they're all sort of merging, but we can talk about that later. But what they've done is they've found channels by which they can organise communities of conspiracy theory believers and target propaganda to them and get them to behave in certain ways and identify them as a very impassioned online demographic. And essentially, they are a mobile propaganda army. Like if you, say, were running the campaign to make Donald Trump president of the United States and the opposition was Hillary Clinton, well, you could target some really effective propaganda about how Hillary Clinton ate children's faces under a Washington restaurant. And this actually happened. Like people were saying these things on the internet in 2016. And you could target that towards Uncle Bert, and he would sit on the internet all day going, oh my God, this is totally true, and share all these things for you and activate the algorithms, making popular content out of total nonsense and sharing this content of propaganda through an internet pipeline, which then gets picked up by other communities of people. And that became the real story, was about the willingness of the political right to go, actually, let's mobilise these people that organised politics never goes near. Let's use them. Let's use the infrastructure of the internet to share like totally fallacious material about our political enemies and make that into a thing. And that's where we live now.
Yeah. And I think it's what's... I can only imagine what it was like researching the book, because reading the book is grueling, and it's a fantastic read. Like it's a page turner, which you wouldn't expect from something of this topic, perhaps. But the thing that struck me throughout it all, and the way that you've positioned this, is just as you've been saying, humans have always been susceptible to cults, to magical beliefs, but the internet has turned this into the kind of mass movement that is being politically weaponized. And your experience in the book is that these people are everywhere. They're not just some crazy, easily identifiable person at the end of the street that you would, cross the road to avoid on sight. But they're people's brothers, they're people's cousins, they're people's mums that are being sucked into a really complex and completely illogical, but apparently cohesive to them, worldview that is based in fear.
Yeah, a worldview based in fear that's been weaponized by the most cynical right-wing political operators in the world. And yeah, like one of the things I discovered when I was writing the book was that the majority of people have some kind of conspiratorial thinking. Whether it's people on the left who are like, yeah, man, Rupert Murdoch having secret meetings. And it's like, spoiler alert, Rupert Murdoch doesn't need to have secret meetings. He has all of his meetings in public. You can probably check his diary. He's not up to anything behind closed doors. He is what he is. But, that we do have a tendency towards conspiratorial thinking. And there's a psychology behind that. When we feel like we lack control over the environment that we're in, we seize on like systems of knowledge that are that privilege us. Like I can't control the chaos of the world, but I have this special insight into why the world is like this, and that makes me a superior person. Like there's an ego gain that comes from conspiracy thinking as special knowledge that can make people feel a lot more secure when they're in a really distressed situation. Now, obviously, the whole world has been in a distressed situation for the past 2 years because of coronavirus. There have been massive economic ructions. There have been all of these other problems with, like everything from the supply of lumber to people's jobs to, am I going to get killed by an invisible killer virus? Like, it's a really distressing time. There was a change to our environment. We were all in lockdown, in Victoria particularly so, and having to behave differently. Like, that's very distressing for people, and people have managed that in various ways. I am exhausted. Other people were prone to going online, trying to find answers that they wanted to believe because they found the situation so challenging and upsetting, and they found propaganda that was ready for them. And of course, if it depends on your level of distress and what your trigger points are. And if you encounter a piece of propaganda that hits you in a particularly vulnerable psychological place, you are very vulnerable to it. There's a story I tell in the book about this woman called Melissa Rain Lively. And Melissa Rain Lively is a well-off, comfortable, middle-class Jewish woman from Arizona. And she was just particularly vulnerable, had things going on in her life, and came across a photograph on the internet. She had gone down a rabbit hole, was sort of looking for things in this sort of state of psychological disquiet. And she came across a piece of propaganda that portrayed people in masks, and it had been photoshopped of Jews being loaded onto trains for concentration camps in masks, basically saying this is what they did last time. Melissa Rain Lively was from a family of Holocaust survivors and had obviously inherited a lot of trauma around the experience of the Holocaust, and she became utterly vulnerable to propaganda in that moment. Was triggered into a state of extreme distress, and of course there was more and more propaganda that she consumed. And she became quite famous as the woman who smashed up a mask stand at Target, screaming, "This shit's over, this shit's over," and busted up this mask stand in this state and then filmed herself doing it. She ended up getting arrested by police, and she was screaming at the police and saying she was the head of QAnon. She spent 6 weeks in intensive therapy, 6 weeks, and came out of it and has been talking about her experiences ever since, going, I don't know what happened to me. I had a mental break. I was suddenly just in this propaganda world. I became convinced it was all true because of the state of distress I was in. And that's been the case for a lot of people. I mean, one of the other things I found really interesting writing the book, and the book talks about this a lot, is the fact that these people are generally not an oppressed proletariat. Like, they're not poor or marginalised people. They're not displaced, working class people who have, suffered class upset because of globalisation. Overwhelmingly, they're middle class people. They're middle management. They are white collar professionals. They're small business owners. And they're people who have a precarious sense of status, like people who, are used to certain levels of privilege and freedom that can be purchased with, their money. And coronavirus and the effects of the pandemic was a sort of system shock to a lot of those people. Their businesses couldn't run the way they wanted them to. They affected their profit margins, whatever. And in terms of looking at the phenomenon of conspiracy belief around the pandemic, that particular group of people were particularly susceptible. And you can see that in the crowds that have been attending the anti-something protests in Sydney and Melbourne in particular.
Yeah, I wanted to draw that in because it is, I think, one of the great things about this book is that you do try to explode that myth that these are those people on the very margins of society. Actually, we know the people that that are working the shit 4 and 5 jobs don't have time to get into this stuff, right? It's generally something taking hold amongst the disenfranchised middle class, and we're seeing that now play out here, as you just said. So if you look at the makeup of those, particularly in Melbourne, week after week after week, protesting against things that actually don't exist anymore, protesting against lockdown when lockdown's over. And you mentioned there it's about status insecurity, and I think that that's key. I want you to tease that out a little bit. So it's not necessarily that these are people who are materially deprived comparatively, but that they feel their position in the world or their purchase on some form of privilege is under threat, either by other groups or because of the changing, the overall changing nature of society. And
Oh, absolutely. I mean, one of the chapters in the book is called Gateway Drugs, and it makes the link between online misogyny and radicalization into these conspiracy cults. And, it's the bugbears around people's sense of status are things like feminism. Like, feminism is terrifying to a small subset of easily upset, nervous individuals. And that is quite an animating value for some people. It's like the feminists are coming to take my normality away, and they're going to upend the apple cart of my life. And you can see that sort of sentiment channeled into somebody like Hillary Clinton, like the sort of ultimate sort of symbol of post 1960s liberal feminism, like a woman who went to law school, built herself up, built a career, was, the supportive political wife, then had the political career of her own, became a senator, became Secretary of State, and then was running for president. Like, if you are terrified that the feminists are coming to get you and take away everything that you love and value, i.e., your sense of being at least superior to 51% of the population whenever you get out of bed, the idea that a woman like Hillary Clinton would become president is terrifying to you. Absolutely, it plays on your primal fear that you may not be that inherently special, or entitled to privilege or power after all. And it's a really dangerous space, like, because, like I said, cynical political operators know that those tenets exist. They channel them towards certain targets, and other even darker forces are very invested in that space as well. Because if you can convince someone to hate women and think that feminists are behind everything that's terrible, it's really easy to convince those people to also project that hatred onto ethnic minorities, and specifically to project it onto Jews. And the involvement of neo-Nazis and neo-fascists with, genocidally racist beliefs, they're absolutely hovering around this space. This is why we're seeing them in Sydney and Melbourne. Like, the boyos from all the various Australian neo-Nazi groups are very visible at those protests, because they know that hanging around long enough is an opportunity to, if it's a cabal, a secret cabal of people running the world and doing all these terrible things, and, it's a pandemic and this cabal is behind, these play into mythologies that have been used to demonize minorities for years and years and years. And there is a very strong anti-Semitic strain that runs through the QAnon mythos, because they've just borrowed it. Like, they've just taken things that already exist in the cultural memory of Western society and repurposed it. But it is particularly disturbing that these people are motivated by what we'd understand as a post-material condition, that they are really anxious about maintaining their status. One of the things that was really interesting in the wake of the January 6th protests was just who had been arrested there. And these were not these lumpen proletariat, unemployed, marginalised people, kicking around the edges to cause trouble. These were people who lived in million-dollar houses, who maybe weren't as successful as their parents. And that is a pretty common theme, is that people who have material wealth but don't quite have the talent of mum and dad entrepreneurially, but also that these were people in their arrest records, because all of this stuff is public in America. They were people who had been in really heated divorces, or they had been in custody battles, or they'd been on the wrong side of an adverse legal finding, or they'd fought bankruptcy or foreclosure. And they had a real sense of how, like, institutional decisions could affect them permanently and immediately and really quickly. And that was a common theme that was running through the protesters who were arrested. As well as the wealth that they had access to. Joy-Ann Reid, who's an MSNBC commentator in the United States, she made a really good point. Like, people make out as if the fervent base around Donald Trump are like blue-collar individuals, and that's never been the case. Like, it's always been a very solidly material movement of people who saw in Trump somebody who would protect and enhance their wealth and privilege. And she was just like, you tell me a working class person in America who can afford to take days off work, fly down to Washington and stay at the Hilton to risk arrest by trying to overthrow the government. Like, that's not a working class expectation in the United States.
And as you know, my friend Janet McCalman's just posted in the chat, the same lower middle class forgotten people were the backbone of Nazism in Germany. You know, it's the same demographic group.
Yeah. Tom Nichols is one of my favourite writers who writes for The Atlantic, who's a conservative,
Yeah.
he's an anti-Trump conservative and he's quite extraordinary. He resuscitated a term that has been out of use for too long, which is lumpen bourgeoisie. These are lumpen bourgeoisie types who have the material resources to be marginal, essentially. I mean, who is sitting on the steps of Spring Street for 2 weeks? You know, who are those people? I see in the chat somebody said, why didn't Thatcher inspire?
I was just going to bring that up. Yeah, it's a good
yeah, well, because Thatcher was very avowedly not a feminist and she wasn't aligned with a movement that was about equality. She represented the opposite. Like, she was very much in favour of inequality. She wasn't interested in sharing the pie. She was interested in assigning the pie to various people. She was notorious in her willingness to destroy other women just for being women.
Yeah.
And, you know, portrayed this sort of notion that other women were weak apart from her. And because her end goal was not equality, she didn't represent a threat to status and privilege by people who already had it. And that's the difference. And that's really where that misogyny comes from. Thatcher engaged in what sociologists call a patriarchal bargain, which is when women align themselves with misogynists and patriarchs and people who are trying to maintain patriarchal like domination and power relations, thinking that if they align themselves to those people, they will be safe. Like, they will be safe from the effects of sexism. And you can see this happen in conservative parties all over the world. By the way, it never works. Never works. Just ask Julie Bishop, who, when she dared put her hand up for the leadership, was destroyed even by her own factional colleagues. So, you know.
And then responded by doing a press conference in red shoes, which would have fueled your QAnon conspiracy theorists even further, given their...
Well, absolutely. So Julie Bishop was targeted by massive coincidence. Scott Morrison's mate, Tim Stewart, who is the QAnon believer and who was pumping out QAnon talking points, i.e. that everybody who wears red shoes represents the satanic cabal. And the theory is they wear red shoes to hide the blood of their child victims before they eat them and milk them for their magical chemicals. And Tim Stewart was absolutely laying into Julie Bishop online, his friend Scott Morrison's factional rival for the leadership, because she wore red shoes. And that was a symbol to Scott Morrison's friend that Julie Bishop was obviously in with a cabal of satanic pedophiles. I mean, you could be really cynical about that, or you could just be fundamentally critical of it. But either way, you see the wages of patriarchal bargaining is to be targeted by the people who you're standing closest to.
Absolutely. I think, you know, it's such an important point that it's not women as women that misogynists hate, it's women and women's power and a change to the existing power structure that they...
Yeah, it's women as agents of change. And women as reminders that maybe they're not so superior after all. You know, and that's really what misogynists are terrified of.
And it's a common theme with it speaks throughout the book, you know, the dripping misogyny from everyone that you talk about being involved.
Oh yeah, absolutely dripping misogyny. And the way that women are targeted and women become villains. I mean, there's like... The book is so full of just these, as you know, horrendous stories about how these groups in various guises have just attacked and destroyed the lives of women and girls, and often as a sort of distraction to hide really terrible things that they have done to women. And yeah, like it really is a story about how hate is channeled and how that hate is channeled towards political ends. Somebody's asked about Kamala Harris.
Yeah,
if Kamala Harris runs for president, this stuff will completely explode. If it was bad for Hillary Clinton, it will be terrifying, I think, for Kamala Harris, because she's a woman of colour, and the idea that she could ascend the highest office in the land will, I think, be incredibly motivating and terrifying for people who are animated around issues of status. I mean, a thing that is really interesting that that I talk about in the book is research done by American political scientists in how what QAnon and associated movements represent is a cleft in the far right. Like, we're used to the far right being neo-Nazis, and ultimately, if you stay in the far right long enough, that's where you end up. You know, there's that wonderful quote from Julius Goat online, which is, the Germans developed a word for the people who didn't believe in the genocidal aims of Nazis, but who joined the party and went along with them and fought for them, and that word is Nazis. Like, ultimately, you hang out with Nazis, you're a Nazi. But the far right in America associated with these conspiracy cults is not so interested with ethnically policing minorities out of their movement. Like, something people even noticed in Australia was that if you look at the anti-lockdown protests in Sydney or Melbourne, you would see quite like diverse crowds. Like, I've been to feminist events in Melbourne that are a lot less diverse than the cultural and ethnic makeup of what's been going on at those anti-lockdown protests. And part of the analysis of, you know, the American political scientists is that you've seen the far right has developed two strands. There's your old school racist far right, but there's also a new school culturalist far right. And they aren't explicitly white supremacists, but they are people who privilege a vision of culture which is white, but do not police people out of fighting for that sort of cultural vision. That sort of American wrap yourself in the flag, praise Donald Trump, using the symbols of Americana, like tailgate parties and barbecues and boat parades and flags, and singing the songs and the rest of it, harks back to this sort of nebulous, you know, when America was great, like make America great again, back to some kind of completely confected vision of what that was before all the feminists and their friends turned up and commies turned up and wrecked it all. And they're fighting for that cultural vision, which means their targets are not ethnic communities yet. Their targets are cultural institutions. They want a vision of culture to triumph, which means that they are mobilizing against cultural generators in the community. So they're bitterly opposed to the mass media, or the MSN, as they call it, MSM, you know, mass media lies, or mainstream media.
Yeah.
They are bitterly opposed to Hollywood, and even though they make up a lot of their mythology based on Hollywood movies they've seen, they constantly identify Hollywood icons, like progressive ones, people like Tom Hanks, as like, the idea that Tom Hanks has ever done anything horrible is just terrifying to me. That anyone would believe that is inconceivable. I mean, what about Winston?
I was going to say, Wilson!
Or whatever, Wilson. So he is in this sort of hit list with a bunch of other celebrities, like the cast of Friends, who are all clones. It's all very, it's bonkers. But they are attacking cultural institutions that create like cultural product. So they're going after the Capitol building because it's a symbol of the cultural power of American government. They're going after Hollywood because it's a symbol of the cultural power of films and media. They're going after mainstream media for that reason as well. And in Australia, you can see them in their sort of protozoan stage. They're trying to get their hooks into powerful cultural symbols of what it means to Australians, like things like the Eureka flag, which is why they attacked Ballarat the other day, shipped in a bunch of people on the Eureka Day weekend, which is a really important like local trading day more than anything else in Ballarat, and harks back to the Eureka Rebellion that happened there, and you know, is part of the cultural history of Australia, but very localised to Ballarat. And of course they caused chaos and shops closed. It was absolutely horrendous what they did. But they're trying to take ownership of Eureka. Like, they are the patriots. They are what represent Australian culture. They are going to take ownership of these cultural symbols. They fly the flag of the Australian Merchant Navy upside down, the red flag at their demonstrations. They're taking ownership of that as like this rebel symbol. They marched on the War Memorial. They're very keen to profile veterans or anybody who's ever been in the Australian Defence Forces. They position a lot of their iconography around those because they're trying to take ownership of the patriotic image of, you know, the Australian Defence Force and the Anzac and those kind of things. So it's really, it is a different movement. And part of the problem that left and small L liberal people have had sort of getting a handle on them is that our default has been thinking that they, one, must be an oppressed class of marginalised people who are poorly educated. That's not true. Like, they have university degrees, lots of experiential education. They're people who are making a willing decision to believe total nonsense. And the other mistake, I think, that was made in their analysis was to go, oh, well, you're just all white supremacists. And if you're at a demo and you're standing next to people of 8 different ethnicities and you're all singing the same song and, you know, genuinely not a racist person, not yet, that you would not see yourself in that criticism. Like, people going, you're a bunch of Nazi white supremacists, you don't see yourself in that. And so reacting to the attempts to publicly shame those people and shame them out of mobilising that way and demobilising them is really, it doesn't work as a tactic, because it doesn't quite reflect who they are. Saying you believe absolute nonsense and anybody who believes this is, you know, shameful and embarrassing. That's more accurate than going after them on the white supremacist line.
And I think one of the interesting things about this is there's someone that does recognise these people and does see them for who they are, and that's the Prime Minister. And there's a comment by Margaret Carol Boglis in our chat here to say the demographic, which this is back from when you were describing the US demographic, sounds similar to ScoMo's quiet Australians. He's absolutely
they're Palmer. I mean, I can tell you now they're Palmer voters, and I can tell you this because in my secret personas, I hang out with them all the time. They're all voting Palmer, and like, they're so narrowly targeted through political micro-targeting through social media. They have been nurtured with propaganda to think and behave a certain way. Voting Palmer and for Craig Kelly and whatever, these are just articles of faith as identifiers in that community. And I can tell you now that that in the like in my personas who are in the communities of these Palmer people, you're getting ads from the Liberal Party every half an hour on Facebook. Like, there's an enormous targeted advertising spend, prioritising voices like Rennick from Queensland, George Christensen, obviously. Like, I'm seeing that advertising all the time. And of course, they create an image of themselves as Palmer voters, and we're going to stick it up, the two parties, and we've been abandoned. You can see all of that written on the Palmer material. Like, the Palmer material says, you know, Liberal, Labor and the Greens have all failed us. We have preferential voting in this country, and you've got to make a choice fundamentally, Liberal or Labor. And those Palmer votes are being guided towards the Liberal Party, like, subtly and cleverly. But, you know, another problem that the left have had, and, you know, I've been speaking to a lot of progressive think tanks about the book and things that I learned, because I want everyone to be onto this. Like, we just don't think that way. Like, it just wouldn't occur to people on the left to go to an election campaign going, let's just micro-target a community of people and blatantly lie to them and share just total nonsense stories about Hillary Clinton eating babies' faces and somehow make that about the Labor Party and create a political brand that's essentially just a front for us to harvest more votes for the Conservative parties who want to stay in power forever. Like, it wouldn't occur to us. Like, I've sat in millions of campaign meetings in my life on, you know, everything from women's rights to, you know, save the whales. And not once has any left-wing person gone, you know what we should do? Start a cult. Like, that's just not a thing. So, yeah, like, I think in terms of the Australian situation, it is really important for us to engage very honestly what's going on and who is stoking this community. I mean, 1 in 5 Liberal and National Party members in Victorian Parliament went down to the anti-lockdown protests and hung out with them. Peter Credlin was there. You know, they get enormous amounts of, well, we're just standing up for freedom, you know, nonsense from Sky After Dark, a very easy ride. And yet at the same time, I'm sitting in groups with 1,000 people saying of these kind of people, saying it's perfectly justified to threaten the life of the 2-year-old child of the Labor Chief Minister of the Northern Territory because he brought in vaccine mandates. Literally 1,000 people going, yeah, well, you get what you deserve. You know, I read about this for Junkie the other day. You know, people who will tell you if, and you know, in their Facebook fora, thinking that you're friends with them, that they're peaceful and, you know, peace loving and just really noble fighters for freedom. And in the same conversation, we'll talk about hanging Daniel Andrews because they think he's a traitor. Like, it's disgraceful.
And it's the slightest sense that there's any, you know, irony or conflict between those two things.
Oh, it's just, it is extraordinary. But once you make a decision, like, because people keep going, you know, what's the value of the anti vax thing? Like, why would politicians be on board with that? And it's like, because if you can convince even 5% of a population to not take a life saving vaccine when more than 5 million people, including now almost a million Americans, have died from coronavirus, you can convince those people to do anything because they have parted company with facts and they're in such a narrow propaganda channel. You can pump them up with beliefs that are completely false and they will replicate them in the public square.
There's a question from my friend Tim here, and I think it's a good one. It's actually two questions, Tim, because I'm going to combine them into one. How do we challenge people who've gone to the dark side? He says it's been so difficult, eventually he's just had to turn them off or block them. But what can we do from the grassroots to change things, to challenge things?
Well, the advice is it basically boils down to take them bowling. I mean, I write about this obviously in depth in the book and talk through a bunch of stuff that's going on and the psychology around it. So if you are struggling with QAnon or lizard people or anti-vax believers in your life, like obviously, I mean, you should just buy my book. I mean, really, you should. But one of the things that became apparent to me from the research I did and the psychologists and others who I spoke to was that conspiracy thinking and conspiratorial belief has a individual psychological origin, but it has a collective sociological solution. And what's really important is to actually maintain social contact and communication with those people. Because people who've come out the other side of the cult, and somebody did ask earlier, like how many people turn around. I can't give you a precise number because, hey, everybody, I was a brainwashed member of a cult that I voluntarily signed myself up to. And yeah, like, you know, I believed in killing the premier and, you know, the lizard people. That's generally not an admission people are very happy to make, which is why it can be really hard to get people out of cults because they see it as a sort of sunken cost. Well, I've lost all my friends and, you know, and my family members, so I'm just going to stay in this cult because I have no other people in my life anymore. It's really important to maintain contact with those people so they can find their way back. People join cults, whether it's QAnon or the Moonies, and by the way, the Moonies are quite Q-spruiking and put a lot of money behind the bad faith political actors who weaponise these people. Amazing, what a coincidence. They join cults because they have an emotional need for belonging or praise or, you know, glory or anything else that is not being met in other parts of their life, and they stay in that cult until it no longer meets their emotional needs. And they can stay in the cult even longer than that because they feel like they have nowhere else to go. And so it's keeping, like I describe it as keep contact alive, like stay in contact with people who have drifted off but don't have the political conversations. You know, if they try to have them with you, it's the way you resist any kind of evangelicizing. It's like, I realize that that's what you're going for and that's what you're into, but I'm not sharing I don't share those values. Let's go look at a tree. Let's go for a walk in the park. Why don't you just come over for dinner? We won't have that conversation. And something like bowling is actually really good because you can't really have a long-term, like big in-depth conversation at bowling, you know, because you're bowling, because you're doing sort of something else. And it's that sociological engagement and socializing and re-socializing people into a community that doesn't hold those beliefs and values is what provides them with a mechanism to get out and to sort of repair whatever distress led them into the cult in the first place.
Really was. And I will, Tim, get you. You might get a copy for Christmas if you're lucky. I've got a interesting couple of questions about the nature of the people that you've discovered in these communities. Firstly, from Margaret Falzon, who says, "Have you noticed that a lot of people in spiritual communities have fallen for these conspiracies? Lots of her Facebook friends seem to have been brainwashed, which has her wondering how spiritually aware they are. Is there a clear connection between people with prior spiritual beliefs and attraction to cult, or
Yeah. Yes, there is. I mean, anyone can, I just want to make it clear, like anyone, if they're vulnerable, can be susceptible to a cult. But QAnon in particular uses the language of evangelical Protestantism, which is very familiar to people. And, you know, it poses the same kind of light versus dark, good versus bad, like very simple rules for making decisions. The psychologist I interviewed for the book talked about the distress resulting in what they call the paranoid schizoid position, where you're so overwhelmed by information and nuance, which can happen in a democracy. In fact, if a democracy is functioning properly, you should have heaps of information and nuance and be tasked with making really complex decisions. But if you're in distress, that is totally overwhelming for you. And somebody going white hats, black hats, which is QAnon parlance, patriots and the cabal, like that's very simple. And sometimes people join spiritual communities in order to get that simplicity. Obviously, not everybody, but there are elements within spiritual community. I can tell you this from my experience of Hillsong. There were a lot of people in there who'd had very damaging life experiences, from everything from refugee journeys to recovering from drug abuse, who were there for the institutional solidity of an organisation that could, like, that promise to heal their trauma through just really simple rules for living. Jordan Peterson is another one. Like Jordan Peterson and his I'm going to rip off the AA 12-step program and make it all about my ego and the fact that women are bad. Like, you know, people gravitate towards that stuff because they want simple answers towards complex questions. And people who are attracted towards spiritual communities, obviously not all of them, but there's a bit more to religion than black and white answers. I think there's rather a lot of cultural products that make that quite clear. But there is that element there. In America, there's this wonderful Canadian researcher called Marc-Andre Argentino, who also has a book coming out that really goes into this stuff. He found a QAnon church called like Omega Kingdom Ministries, where a traditional charismatic Christian congregation just went, there's something in this QAnon thing, and it has literally merged the beliefs of QAnon and the Prophet Q with the Christian Bible and these traditions of American Protestantism. And like I said, if you're susceptible, there's a familiarity to it, which, you know, you can read in your faith education, your faith context into this new manifestation. I mean, QAnon use a term called the Great Awakening, which is like a habit of evangelical Protestantism in the United States. Every few generations they have a great awakening where they sort of realign all their beliefs, and the structure of their sort of movement changes, and, you know, you get these sort of Christian revivals going on. And the Great Awakening is what Q promises, that there's going to be this literal, like, day of judge, like a worldly day of judgment, where the patriots are going to rise up under their leader, God Emperor Donald Trump. I'm not joking, they actually believe this. And Donald Trump and his allies, the White Hats, are going to turn off the power and activate an emergency broadcast system. And then the military are going to arrest all the people who eat the children, like Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton's number one, you know. And they are going to hang them all. And then America will be great again. And this will be the Great Awakening, when everybody wakes up and realizes what's been going on. You know, and you can see that if you come from that kind of spiritual background, you know those terms, you know those sort of concepts, they're familiar to you. And, you know, for people who are looking for answers or simplicity or moral guidance, how to be good in a bad society, or, let's be really honest, there is an element of narcissism that goes on with this as well. I'm a patriot, I'm special, I have special knowledge, I'm on the side of good. And you hear this in QAnon stuff all the time. They're constantly talking about sheep and sheeple, and you just need to wake up. And these lunatics running around Sydney and Melbourne and other places, calling themselves pure bloods, holding up signs going, you know, my sperm is going to be really valuable because it has no vaccine in it. I mean, it's like, you're not special.
Former Q, ladies, former Q.
Former Q. You're not special for not getting vaccinated. Like, you're like kamikaze.
Yeah.
And but you can see that notion of vainglory and specialness and narcissism and this performance of superiority is really important to those people. And that's one of the ways the propagandists manipulate them so sophisticated, like in such a sophisticated way.
Well, with that in mind, and the fact that, you know, they're now planning for the return of Donald Trump, and this, you know, grand moment to take over the world,
just like Jesus, but not
Jesus, right? But with a better comb over. So there's a question from Jeffrey Miller that I think goes to this, and just how cohesive this movement is, and how long it will hold together. So he's asking, have you noticed any significant ideological factions developing in the Q communities?
Oh, there are heaps of factions they're all fighting in America at the moment, and I'm really, because Q stopped posting after Biden won the election,
So there's the answer
which
to that.
was wow, amazing, what a coincidence.
Funny that.
Yeah, funny that. But heaps of Q believers, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Lauren Boebert, Ron Watkins, who a lot of people think is Q, is running for Congress somewhere in America. Like they're entering the political mainstream in the United States, which is so terrifying. But the factions developed sort of after I'd finished the book, which was great because then I didn't have to like get bogged down in it. But people like Travis View, who run the QAnon Anonymous podcast, which updates on what's going on in Q-land, they're keeping very close track of this. But people are fighting over Q's audience essentially. Factions is very. Factions is a very flattering term for what's really entrepreneurs competing for a fractured market is what's happening. And these various personalities are trying to claim the Q audience and sort of have themselves anointed as the new Q. There's the guy who led the JFK Jr. Miraculous Return believers to Dallas, where a group of QAnon believers literally went to the grassy knoll in Dallas waiting for JFK Jr.'s return. He's been dead for 22 years, but there's this faction that believe that he will return and be Trump's running mate in 2024. Then there was Ghost Ezra, who was on Telegram, who was gently guiding his audience towards more and more anti-Semitic belief and, genocidal concepts. There's another guy called Whiplash. Like there's a bunch of them who are all trying. There's a guy called E. There's a German guy who does various bits and pieces, and they're all sort of fighting one another for the spoils of this community of people that, by the way, like numbers in the millions, who are willing to spend money to fuel the fantasy of the mythology that Q offered them. So, I mean, that's in some ways that's an opportunity, but it's all about how they vote. Are those people still going to vote Republican? Probably. Are their pro-Palmer votes going to be channeled towards the Liberal Party in Australia? Probably. So, whatever kind of arguments they're having over doctrine are essentially moot, because these are very mobile communities based around that are manipulated by people who they can't see. I mean, let's remember the anti-lockdown protests in Sydney and Melbourne in June were organised by a group of extremists in Germany who coordinated all those worldwide protests and drafted the propaganda and workshopped the messaging. And, these Australians went along with it because they were willing believers. And whatever's going on with them internally, fighting over things like, there are opportunities in those fractures where personality, like, in a cult of personality, if you've got more than one personality, it can be really problematic. But this is all the more reason for people to keep contact alive with the people who they know who are in that, because that kind of fighting and chaos can reveal that the movement is not meeting their emotional needs in the way that they want it to, and to be there when that becomes something that they want to leave behind is really important. But yeah, I mean, it's carnage. It's sort of enjoyable to watch, but at the end of the day, I know that these are still people who, if they thought they could get away with it, would kill the Premier of Victoria. So yeah.
It's funny until it's not, right?
It's funny until someone dies. And let's just put this into context. There is a body count to this movement. Yeah. There was a mass murder in Germany that was associated with the Q movement. There has been all kinds of different acts of violence in the United States. You can read about them in my book, with proto-terrorists trying to blow things up and occupy bridges and do all kinds of things. And in Australia, like, we've already had people associated with the anti-something protests in Victoria be arrested for bomb making and weapons offences. Like, that's already happening here. And if you match that to the rhetoric you see online about killing Daniel Andrews, the nooses being marched down Spring Street, the threats against Michael Gunners, let's just repeat this 2-year-old child, you have a context for people who are in a sealed information environment. They are not taking cultural instruction from government, from media, from cultural products like Hollywood, and increasingly getting estranged from their friends. Like, if they are convinced that Hillary Clinton is eating babies, like, if I knew somebody who was eating babies, I would probably do something about it. So if you can convince somebody that's happening, that's powerful and terrifying.
Catherine, and your book is both powerful and terrifying as well, but also a very enjoyable read, which I will finally finish tonight. I've got about 20 pages to go. Thank you. We are out of time. This always happens when I talk to you, whether it's in private or in public, the time goes like this. And I think we could keep going for another hour, but thank you so much. Everyone, if you haven't got hold of it, do. It is a really illuminating look at something that we all need to be really aware of. And I think at a time when we have political leaders that are only too willing to exploit this, those of us that are concerned about that, we need to be prepared, and the best way to be prepared is with information, and that's what Van has done for us. So thank you so much.
Oh, Emma, it is no secret, I think you are the best. And it is lovely to chat with you and be hosted by Per Capita.
Thank you so much, my love. And you're our last guest for the year. Talk about ending on a high. We've had a really great conversation. I'm sorry I couldn't get to all of your questions. I will mention that Janet McCullman made me almost laugh out loud by referring to her late husband having an erotic nightmare about Maggie Thatcher. I will be punishing you for that, Janet. I nearly lost my cool. But thank you all so much for joining us this year. Our event series will be back most likely in February. Look out for a big announcement about an in-person event from us coming soon next week in your Per Capita newsletters. Thank you for your support, all of you, this year. Thank you so much, Van, for joining us today. And we'll see you all in 2022.